Did somebody say Amara? Here are the best Amara builds in Borderlands 3, which all dominate endgame content. Whether you're punching things from range or shooting them in the face, these builds will satisfy your siren senses. Why am I still talking? Let's get to the first build. We open with Amara's quintessential melee build, which I'm dubbing Mystic Striker. This build excels at maximizing the damage potential of your melee attacks, whether it be your guns, grenades, action skill, or something else. This build deals incredible damage in a number of different ways, and if you're looking for the skill tree, here it is on screen now. What we're trying to achieve here is obviously increase our melee damage, but also support it, which we can do through skills like Free the Soul and Unweave the Rainbow. We get massive boosts to the punchy through Illuminated Fist and Find Your Center, and lifesteal is provided thanks to points in Ebb and Flow, restoring our health for every melee damage kill. How will we be dealing that damage though? Well, obviously we'll want a face puncher, ideally the ×14 variant, and ideally one with an action skill and melee anointment. We'll be using regular phase graph to activate that anointment, and thanks to Expedite, the augment we'll be using, each time we kill the phase grasped enemy, we'll get it back again much faster. The face puncher obviously deals melee damage, and why the ×14 is preferred over the ×7 is for each of its pellets it'll proc body and mind. But that's not all. Thanks to a point in Illuminated Fist, it'll proc again, totaling 28 mini novas, which add up to a whole lot of damage. Obviously they're novas, so they deal splash damage too, and that's why skills like Heavy Rain are great, because we want to be boosting splash damage also. Instead of the face puncher, you can use the Blade Fury, and you'll want the Masher variant for the reasons I've mentioned, but the Gatlin of course will do well too. But the preference here is the face puncher. When we're mobbing, we want to be dealing cryo damage, so make sure you set your attuned element to cold hearted. Cryo damage synergizes best with punch attacks, but there's also plenty of skills in the purple tree that feed or feed off the frozen. Other sources of cryo melee damage can come in the form of our grenades, which obviously will be wanting the fish slap, ideally with triple link rolls, and you'll also want one to cover all of the elements with matching action skill and elemental anointments. That goes for the Stinger too, which is the shield we'll be using. Each time we activate our action skill, we'll summon a Nova powerful enough to defeat all that's around us, while providing 50% bonus melee damage while it's full. The preferred artifact while mobbing is the Radiation Stone Static Charge, which adds shock and radiation damage to each of our melee sources, while chaining 25% of that damage to 1 or 2 nearby enemies, and those change proc for each pellet of the face puncher. Preferred rolls on this artifact include max size, area of effect damage, and melee damage, and action skill cooldown rate is also good. The White Elephant is also a decent option as an artifact, and a Knife Drain prefix on any artifact is great for survivability. The sting of our shield's novas, the slaps of the fish slap, and the face puncher's punches will have you absolutely dominating the mobbing arena, but there's much more that this build can achieve. When you find yourself within the bossing arena, you'll want to switch it up by switching your action skill to phase cast and equipping a fire stinger, Unleash the Dragon, and Psycho Stabber. However, you'll need 2 Psycho Stabbers, one with an action skill and melee damage boost, and another with the elemental crit anointment. What we can do here is pretty nasty. You see, the Unleash the Dragon allows our fire dots to deal damage based on the initial hit, and those dots are massive thanks to the Stinger, which can comfortably mount bosses on its own. However, they get even bigger when we switch to the elemental crit Psycho Stabber and land a critical hit, boosting the dot damage to phenomenal heights. This is one of the most broken interactions in the game, allowing you to dot for over 1 billion. The first Psycho Stabber activates the melee anointment thanks to phase cast, and the second one's responsible for the damage, which is just insane. And if your target's out of reach, you can always apply the dot using the fish slap. This build can also deal with bosses in another way that's almost as deadly. You can equip a Guardian Angel with the Fate's Flare anointment and take that orb out for a stroll. Every time you punch it, you'll charge it up, increasing its damage, where the final hit will pop bosses like bubbles. The reason we use the Guardian Angel here is for that potential 500% V2 damage increase, getting closer to that cap the further we are from our enemy. but the Psycho Stab is going to work too. And you'll want to change the attuned element depending on the health bar you're facing. Whether you're mobbing or bossing, the class mod we'll be using is the Muse, mainly for its 1 point in Illuminated Fist and Laid Bare. The latter essentially weakens enemies whenever they're damaged by our action skill, making it great for bossing. The Muse used to be able to drop with 3 points in Illuminated Fist, but can't anymore. There are some included in the save file if you wanted to try them out. I didn't use them myself, this build is plenty strong enough. It'll have you dominating all endgame content with ease, punching things from a distance. Up next, Cast Driver Amara, a build that pretty much says what it does in its title, so on to the next one. It's a build that utilizes one of the most powerful anointments in the game and one of the most unique class mods. If you're looking for the skill tree, here it is on screen now. You'll notice we venture into the green tree, pick up the blue tree capstone, head into the orange tree just before its capstone, allowing us to go deep enough in the purple tree to pick up Expedite. We'll get into why we do all that in a little bit, but first we'll start with the class mod, which is integral to this build. We're going to be using the Spiritual Driver, which every time we activate our action skill, triggers a dot effect on our self in the form of our attuned element. That self-harm effect is important for a few reasons. The main one being how it stacks up mindfulness, which increases our movement speed per stack, synergizing perfectly with our class mod's other effect, which increases our gun damage based on how fast we're moving. And it caps out at 500%. That's a big percentage and puts our damage ceiling incredibly high. Because of that, you'll want a driver with +3 in mindfulness. The other roles don't matter. But for passives, action skill cooldown rate is great in this build. Splash damage is also good, along with weapon type damage and manufacturer crit damage. The Spiritual Driver serves as a base for us to build damage upon, and we can do that in a couple of different ways. One of them is by equipping a low level Revolter, allowing us to break our shield automatically when we activate our action skill. We can then use action skill and anointments. The ideal augments for a Revolter in this build is Fleet due to the increased move speed. In this build, you can easily activate the bonus 200% shock damage and 50% increased fire rate from the Revolter 24/7. And that's thanks to the shield reboot Guardian rank, which triggers our shield to regen each time we kill an enemy. And killing enemies comes easy. You can pick up a low level Revolter by having it drop in game on a level 72 character and switching over to a new character and grabbing it out of the lost loot machine. Of course you don't need it, it's just there for extra damage, and action skill start one is fine. And even one with the skill cooldown rate anointment can bolster the speed of your action skill cycle. Other than being the perfect foil to break our shield constantly, the Spiritual Driver's self-harm effect provides another synergy. That is with the Elemental Projector artifact, which provides 129% bonus elemental damage of the types in which we suffer from. We apply our attuned element each time we activate our action skill, and therefore can reap this bonus elemental power. You don't even need to use a gun that matches that element either, as with points in infusion, we can automatically convert a portion of that damage to the correct one. The elemental projector you should be looking for is a Victory Rush to provide bonus damage and movement speed after we kill a badass enemy. That effect lasts for 60 seconds, making it easy to sustain. Outside of that, the Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge is never a bad choice, and you can even try to hunt down some God Roll Company men. The Toboggan is also an option if you feel like one-shotting some bosses. It's perfect because it provides bonus movement speed when we slide, and we deal damage the faster we move. Couple that with its bonus amp damage and swap out the Revolter for an Infernal Wish to add an extra projectile, and you will wipe that health bar off the face of Pandora. Key rolls on our artifact include mag size, area of effect damage in either slot 2 or 3, and action skill cooldown rate is great as well. The reason we put an emphasis on skill cooldown rate is because we're using phase cast, which does have a longer cooldown than ties that bind. And of course you can use that if you'd like, but this build is made with phase casting in mind. The reason we use phase cast is because of the massive 250% bonus weapon damage we get each time we activate our action skill. When you activate it, you'll become Super Saiyan, so strong that you don't even need the damage the driver can provide, but if you wanted it, it's there to provide even more. We circumvent the default 28-second cooldown on phase casts in a number of different ways. One of those is by picking up Avatar, which lets us activate our action skill a second time during that cooldown period, essentially cutting it in half. We can also use it to stack Transcend twice, granting a massive bonus to our critical hit damage. We also use Expedite for that 30% bonus cooldown rate after we kill an enemy with our action skill. It's great when it's active, but you need to be wary of targeting the weaklings. One tip is that phase cast will hit twice, once when it passes through an enemy, and again if it contacts the surface next to them. For grenade mods, I like its pits for the debuff, and the Hex is good for proccing sustainment while you're reloading, giving you some lifesteal. Whatever grenade mod you go with though, you want one to cover each of the action skill and elemental anointments. This build is incredibly strong. We get 250% increased weapon damage through our anointment and up to 500% more through the spiritual driver, and that's just a couple of things. This build doesn't favour any particular weapon type either, allowing you to use anything you'd like to its maximum potential. If you wanted to serve up a siren smackdown, then this build is for you. Now on to Bind Over Matter, a build that excels while mobbing and has you covered so you can dominate bosses too. It makes use of the absurd amounts of mayhem scaling applied to ties that bind, which has her absolutely obliterating the mobbing field. But remember, you can take advantage of it in boss fights too, as long as there's another enemy around. This is the build featured in the 2024 Best Builds video, and if you're looking for the skill tree, here it is on screen now, this time with augments. Obviously we're using Ties That Bind for its incredible mobbing ability, and we want to be able to support it as much as we can. One way we can do that is by picking up Avatar, which lets us activate it twice in a single cooldown cycle. Restless also helps us bind enemies more often, and Indiscriminate makes it even deadlier while it's active. It's not just skills that help us here, but our class mod too. The one we'll be using is the Phaserker, which increases our max rush stacks and provides bonus weapon damage and cooldown rate per stack. At max stacks we'll get 75% bonus weapon damage and action skill cooldown rate, allowing us to proc our shield's effects more often. That shield is obviously an action skill start revolter, providing us with 200% bonus elemental shock damage and 50% bonus fire rate for 15 seconds when we activate our action skill. We use the Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge for bonus weapon damage, which is easy to stack on Amara thanks to the ease in which she applies dots to enemies. That's also the reason why I generally run a consecutive hits anointment, but next to mags is good too for weapons you're not often reloading. And obviously if the weapon deals splash damage, I do like an action skill and splash damage anointment. Another good artifact is the Company Man, although these are difficult to farm for, and essentially we want these because of their ability to roll with area of effect damage. I wouldn't use one without it, but a god roll will eclipse the Pearl. For grenade mods, I generally like the It's Pissed for that extra bit of damage, and you'll want one to cover all of the action skill and elemental anointments. There's a bunch of weapons you can use in this build. It's definitely not limiting in that sense. Because we're spec'd into splash damage boosting skills, splash damage weapons work well. And obviously we've got elements rolling around with infusion, so we can add extra flavour to weapons with a simple taste. It is up to preference, but weapons with high projectile count will get more out of Indiscriminate, and because we're spec'd into heavy rain, you want to avoid the Unkempt Herald. On the other vein though, the Torrent's projectiles fire much faster and is a lot better in this build. If you want to dominate bosses just as well as this build tears through mobs, all you need to do is swap to Phase Cast to activate a Phase Cast anointment for 250% bonus weapon damage on a weapon made for bossing. There's plenty of them in here in this save file, and landing Phase Cast on your enemy twice will double stack Transcend for a massive critical hit damage bonus. Moving on to Moxie's Blade Witch, a build that maximizes the damage output of one of the most overpowered weapons in the game. And if you wanted more information about the builds we've covered in today's video, Moxie's channel is a great resource. What weapon does this build center around? Well, of course it's the Blade Fury. Why it's unique we'll get to in a little bit. First, here's the skill tree. You'll notice it's similar to the skill tree featured in the Mystic Striker build, but we've pivoted slightly to enhance all of the Blade Fury's offerings. Those offerings come in the form of its projectiles. It fires knives, which deal 100% physical splash damage at no splash radius, as well as 50% non-elemental melee damage that obviously can't crit. This gives us 2 avenues to increase our damage, and there's one class mod that excels at that. Where something like the Muse with the Pointed Illuminated Fist would only increase the melee portion, the Spiritual Driver will increase both the gun damage and melee damage portion of the Blade Fury, making it the clear class mod of choice. You'll definitely want one with plus 3 points in mindfulness, and ideal roles include melee damage, you'll definitely want that, alongside mag size, splash damage, or action skill cooldown rate. The Spiritual Driver increases our damage while we're moving, up to 500%. Points in mindfulness provide a stacking movement speed bonus each time we get damaged, and that damage can be automatically applied to ourselves every time we activate our action skill through the Spiritual Driver's unique effect, and that damage is always in the form of our attuned element. We'll be using Ties That Bind to stack up mindfulness simply by looking at the ground, and if we ever want to activate action skill and anointments, just phase grasp your target, kill them, and they'll be applied. Ties That Bind also bolsters our indiscriminate procs, and because there is a gun portion attached to this melee weapon, we get the benefit of all those ricochets. The shield we'll be using is a low level Revolter, which grants us 200% bonus shock damage each time it depletes, along with 50% increased fire rate. We use a low level one because we can auto break it through the Spiritual Driver, and you can get one simply by having it drop in your game before switching over to a low level character and getting it from the Lost Loot Machine. A low level Revolter allows us to activate action skill and anointments for even more damage, and thanks to the shield reboot Guardian rank, our shield will recharge each time we kill an enemy, so we can constantly feel the effects of the Revolter. The ideal augments for the Revolter are Fleet to increase our move speed, because in this build, move speed equals damage. Speaking of damage, we get a hefty chunk of that through Burn Both Ends, which increases our physical and elemental damage by 5% per stack, stacking up to 25 times, and we can reach that cap thanks to the Spiritual Driver's self-harm effect. The recommended artifact for this build is an Elemental Projector Static Charge. The Elemental Projector prefix increases our elemental damage by 129% for each elemental status effect applied to us, and that's automatically given to us thanks to the Spiritual Driver. The static charge portion provides 100% bonus shock damage to the melee portion of the Blade Fury, as well as any other melee sources, and will also chain lightning to nearby enemies. Those other melee sources come in the form of the Fish Slap, the recommended grenade for this build. Triple link rolls is the best, and you'll want an elemental one with a matching action skill and elemental anointment. You should prioritize getting a cryo one for mobbing. Radiation's also good, but I prefer that anointment on the Revolter, and of course you'll want an incendiary one for one particular artifact. That artifact is of course the Unleash the Dragon, which can help you burn through enemies like nothing else. It massively increases the fire dots applied to your enemies, and with an elemental crit anoint on your Blade Fury, you can have a lot of fun pairing those two together. Landing crits will have your enemies consumed by a flaming nova. It is a peak option while bossing, and for particularly chunky bosses, you want to apply the dot through the Fish Slap and finish them off with the Blade Fury. Outside of that combination, the anointments I recommend on the Blade Fury are either a reload stack or action skill and melee damage, and I prefer the Gatlin variant over the Masher in this instance. For rolls on our artifacts, you'll obviously want melee damage. I like mag size and area of effect damage in slot 2 or 3 as well. Of course you can't go wrong with action skill cooldown rate, but thanks to Expedite, the recommended augment, you shouldn't have much problem cycling Ties That Bind over and over again. Piecing this all together, you'll be flying across the battlefield throwing knives like Ghostface. Nothing will be able to stop you except yourself, so just be careful you don't accidentally fluff the map.